was invited to talk at this conference, I read the blurb about the conference, and it said, on the one hand, we're going to be dealing with data and metrics, and on the other hand, we're going to be dealing with creativity and qualitative. Now, what I'd like to say is learning analytics can and should bring those elements together. There should be creativity in analytics. There should be qualitative elements to analytics. We need all those together if we're going to use analytics to enhance learning. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a brief introduction to learning analytics, because I know some of you know the field of analytics inside out, and some of you have probably never encountered it before. So just to get us all on the same page, that we're talking about the same thing. Then talk about, well, why do we need to think about future possibilities? Why aren't we talking about what's happening now on the ground? Then to talk you through some of those future possibilities, and then to talk you through just ways of implementing them in your institution, or perhaps of supporting that implementation in your institution. So to start with the definition, I'm an academic, we start with definitions. This is the definition of learning analytics, which was developed by the Society of Learning Analytics Research back at its first conference, and it is a definition which has served us well. And if you look at it, it is largely in two parts. The first bit is to do with data, but the second bit is to do with what we do with that data. And for me, that is the important bit. Some people get hung up on, hey, I've collected a lot of data and look, I've analysed it. But unless you're actually putting that into a teaching environment, unless it's actually improving somebody's lives and their learning or their teaching, then you haven't really done learning analytics, to my mind. So if we rephrase this in terms perhaps more of this conference, learning analytics is making use of the data to enhance our teaching, our learning, and our learning environments. And the reason I've used that picture is just to give you a sense of some of the difficulty of this, because when we use data, we're not looking at learning. It's very difficult to look at learning to see it happening, even if you can do. What we are looking at is the traces that people leave behind in that process of learning and teaching. And if we look at footprints in the sand, they are traces that are left behind. And in some ways, they're very clear. But actually, without being there, without having the contextual information, I can't tell you why those footprints lead to the sea and no footprints lead back again. And there could be a multitude of explanations, but I need that context. So that's one of the ways that the qualitative has to inform the quantitative to make it make sense. So just a quick run through if you haven't encountered learning analytics before, particularly if you're a student, these are the ways that you might be using learning analytics. You may already be using learning analytics. They all come together in terms of becoming better learners, helping you to learn. But there are also things there which you need support with, possibly. It doesn't necessarily come naturally to people to reflect on their learning, to self-reflect on their learning. These are metacognitive skills, these are self-regulating skills, these are things which need to be built into teaching to support you to reflect and self-reflect, and particularly to do that with data. So quite often you may be presented with data in a dashboard, but until somebody has taught you through, well, what does this mean? How do I interpret this? You can get quite lost in data. So there is a teaching role and a learning role there. So those are the sort of things that learners are doing with analytics. Some of the things that educators are doing, well, a lot of those things educators have been doing for time immemorial, haven't we? We've always been monitoring the learning process. We've always been trying to identify problems. We've always been trying to see if things are going wrong and how we can help out. So the data supports us in the things that we've always been able to do. And it also helps us to do some of those things better, like assessing the usefulness of learning materials. You know, sometimes we put something really cool up online, we think it's really cool, we think, oh, students are going to really enjoy that, they're going to spend an hour or so. And then you look at the data and think, they clicked on it, they clicked off it. What happened there? Or, on the other hand, at the Open University, we quite often find things that we, as educators, think, well, that's a quick read. We find that students have got really stuck on it and they've gone back and forward and back and forward. So the data helps us to understand what we were sharing already. So I'm just going to run through a few examples of learning analytics. I've got 3 examples here. I think generally if you say learning analytics to people, they'll go, well, when I open my VLE, when I open Canvas, when I open Blackboard, when I open Moodle, I've got a dashboard. So they think of learning analytics as dashboards. So this is just 3 other examples to open up possibilities perhaps for you. This one is a social network diagram. And if you've never seen a social network diagram before, this is describing a discussion forum, a student discussion forum. The red blobs represent individuals, and the black lines represent if those individuals have communicated with each other. And I've put some sort of blue rings and arrows on just to point some areas out. Up at the top right, we've got some disconnected students. They didn't talk to anybody. They're just single red dots. They're stacked up together because we can't really tell much about them. Down at the bottom right, we've got a couple of potentially low-performing students. They've been in the forum, but they've only talked to one person. They're not having very productive conversations. But in the middle, we've got the potentially high-performing students, very engaged, talking to people. We've got the information brokers who are highly central. They're probably the educators. They're probably the ones who are talking to everybody. Now, on its own, that tells us a few things. But if we put that together with what the forum was designed for, what the forum was trying to achieve, that contextual, qualitative information, we can suggest things that might change. So, for example, one of these social network graphs developed with the Snap tool was used on a discussion forum in a university in Canada. And they analysed it and they said, well, we found out that the educators are having lots of discussions with the high-performing students, and they're answering all their questions. But the low-performing students, the educators never respond to their questions. What's happening there? So they went to the 2 teaching assistants and said, why aren't you talking to the low-performing students? And they said, well, there are some questions that are asked that are so easy, we think the other students should answer them. So we don't answer those questions, we leave it for the other students. Well, sometimes the other students did answer, and sometimes they didn't. But the impression that was given to the low-performing students was, the educators just ignore me. I ask things and nothing happens. And so that's the sort of thing that you can get out of this sort of diagram. You can have conversations around the data. Now, to move from what was happening in Canada to something that's happening now in Australia, this is an academic writing analytics tool, which is in use at the University of Technology at Sydney. It's just been released open source, so if it interests you, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you about it. It's to support reflective writing, and again, reflective writing, metacognitive skill, self-regulating skill, something that we want students to be able to do and to be able to do well. But it's not something that comes naturally to people. You need a bit of support in doing it. I mean, educators need a bit of support in doing it. It's a tricky thing. This tool allows students to write a piece of reflective writing. Perhaps they've been asked to do that for an assignment. And then they can put the draft into this tool, and the tool will code it up for them. And the tool, so at the top there, we've got an example of some writing. You probably can't read it from that distance, but it's coded up. The blue squares are saying, these are initial thoughts and feelings about a significant experience. The magenta circles are saying this is a challenge of new, surprising, unfamiliar ideas. And the triangles are saying this is how new knowledge might lead to change. So this gives students a way of reflecting on their reflection, of thinking about what they've been doing there, and then perhaps revising it before they hand it in to be submitted, or before they just file it away as something they've used as a learning experience. Of course, the blue box on one side gives the warning. It says the algorithm can tell you if this is the sort of language of reflection, it can't tell you if this makes sense. That's not what the algorithm is doing. So you could write a lot of nonsense, the algorithm would still grade it. So there's a role for the human, but there's also a role for what's going on with the analytics. And then just to give you a third example of analytics, this is from a tool that we developed some time ago at the Open University called iSpot. It's an informal learning tool. So we do build it into some of our courses, but most of the people who use it are people who've spotted some form of wildlife and want to know what it is. And if you go to iSpot, you've got a photograph, you've got a description of where you found something. You can go to iSpot, you post all those details, and somebody else in the social network, usually within an hour, will post some sort of definition of what that might be. So, for example, this is an insect which I took a photo of a few years ago. I put up on iSpot, and I got several responses. The first response was a really useful one. It said it's a speckled bush cricket, and they said it's got no wings, it's a juvenile. But then somebody came in the next day and said, no, it is a speckled bush cricket, but it's an adult male. Now, to be honest, I'm not that into insects, so I didn't really care. But if I had cared, how would I judge between those? Because the first person is Bob the birder, and the second person is Michael Skelton. Well, I don't know Bob, and I don't know Michael. They could be really flaky people who know nothing about insects. On the other hand, they could be speckled bush cricket experts. The way that I can judge is the analytics which are built into the platform. Because if you can see, there are little things in rings. There's some little butterflies over here. Those little butterflies mean that person has engaged with lots of observations about insects. They know about insects. Not only have they posted identifications, but people on the platform who are genuinely experts, who have come in with accreditation, have okayed their identifications. The person at the top doesn't have as many butterflies, but they do have a golden butterfly, which tells me something else about them. So they're both people who know about insects. They're both people who I can trust on this subject. Obviously, if they all had fish by them, I'd think, well, they're very good on fish, but they're not very good on speckled bush crickets. So that is taking some of the data and it is using it to support my learning and to support the learning of anybody else who comes to this observation and is looking through the platform. So that's 3 different examples of learning analytics from 3 different countries, which takes us away from dashboards. Moving forward, let's think about analytics more from your perspective, about where are you going with learning analytics? What are you trying to achieve with learning analytics? What is your institution trying to achieve with learning analytics? And why are we thinking about the future? We're thinking about the future because it takes a long time to implement learning analytics, to do it properly. Because if you're going to do it properly, not only do you have to bring the data and the expertise together, you've also got to trial these things to see that they work before that you actually roll them out for students. So when we're developing analytics for the future. And when you think about what happens over a period of 10, 12 years in technology, things change very fast. So if we'd been developing analytics 10 years or so ago, we probably wouldn't have been paying much attention to data from Facebook and Twitter because they weren't really much around. We'd probably been ignoring MySpace as a source of learning about student learning. We wouldn't have been planning for smartphones because we didn't have smartphones. We certainly wouldn't have been planning for MOOCs because they didn't emerge till 2008. They didn't get big till 2012. But if we'd been thinking about, well, what's going on in the background? What are the big up-and-coming ideas? We might have been thinking about networked learning. We might have been thinking about mobile learning. We might have been thinking about connectivism. And all these ideas would have helped us to develop analytics, which we could then apply when the new technologies came in, when new things changed. So that's why we need to think about the future. We also need to think about where we're going. What are we trying to achieve? It's no good just starting with the data, saying we've got a wonderful data set over here, what can I do with it? Let's think about what are we trying to achieve, and then how do we go there? So at the Open University, where I'm based, it's a distance learning institution. It takes you a long time to get a degree. There's multiple points where you can drop out. Retention is an issue for us. So we spend a lot of energy thinking about how can we develop analytics for retention. And Kevin, who's sitting over there, you know, one of his full-time things he thinks about is how best to do this. But if we work on a wider scale, you know, if we think about what is the European Union trying to achieve in terms of education and training? Well, learning analytics fits really well with the idea of being open and innovative and embracing the digital era. But I'm not sure it fits so well with strong support for teachers, trainers and school leaders, because the development hasn't necessarily transformed into supporting people to use this on the ground. And also look at the things the European Union wants education to be doing. It wants it to be developing active citizenship, well-being, inclusion, civic competencies. These aren't things which immediately spring out of the data. These are things that we have to plan for and think, well, how could we use data to help us to achieve that? But of course, in a year's time, this may all be irrelevant to us. So let's talk a bit more nationally. What's happening in Scotland? Well, these are the sort of things that the Scottish Government are trying to achieve. And you can see the Scottish Government is much more focused on working towards equality. So from a learning analytics perspective, that prompts us to think, well, how could we use analytics to support equality? How can we collect data which will help us to monitor where we are with equality and where we're going with equality? What sort of interventions would we like to be able to make? And how can data help us with that? Now, these are the overarching national, international frameworks, but your institution will have a framework. Your institution will have an idea of where it's going. That will be published somewhere. The QAA, for example, knows where it's going. It knows where it's going with enhancement, what it's trying to achieve with enhancement. And once you've got an idea of where you're going, then you can think about what you're doing with learning analytics. Don't start with, I've come up with some small predictor, because why have you come up with the predictor, and how is it going to help learners, and how is it going to help educators? So I'm going to talk through some of the possibilities that are on the horizon now. And these are possibilities we developed for the LACE project, Learning Analytics Community Exchange. So it's a European project which was brought together to support the development of learning analytics in Europe, to build communities, to get people talking to each other, to build standards, that sort of thing. And one of the things we were charged with doing was thinking about how are learning analytics going to develop. And the way we did that was through a policy Delphi study. Now, some of you may have carried out Delphi studies. A Delphi study typically starts with a very difficult question, brings a lot of expert opinions together, and gradually refines those expert opinions till you get one answer. A policy Delphi is almost the opposite of that. Comes up with an area you want to explore, and then goes to experts and finds as many different perspectives as possible. To be able to do that with experts around the world, we developed 8 provocations, 8 ways that learning analytics could develop over the next decade. Not necessarily the way it will develop, and not necessarily the way we want it to develop, but things to think about. And so we could then ask experts, do you think this is likely? Do you think this is possible? Do you think this is desirable? Because if we know what we're working towards, we can all work together on it. If we know what we don't want to work towards, we can be careful to avoid it. So I'll introduce these provocations to you, and you can think about how they impact on your life, how you feel about them, how your institution might feel about them. The first one, a decade from now, learners are monitored by their learning environment. And actually, if you think about it, that is happening around us all the time. So in this room at the moment, there will be a thermostat, and it's trying to regulate the temperature so it's an ideal temperature for us all to learn. And sometimes that works in lecture theatres and sometimes it doesn't work in lecture theatres. And we've all had experiences when that doesn't work and how difficult it is to work in a room which is too cold or too hot. So that form of analytic can be very useful. I went to Australia recently. I went to RMIT, and they were using monitoring the environment. They had heat sensors in their lecture theatres, and the heat sensors could tell them how many people were in a lecture theatre at a time. So they couldn't tell them who was in the lecture theatre, but they could tell from that if they filled the lecture theatre to capacity, if they needed a bigger lecture theatre, if people needed to be in a smaller room. So they could reschedule, re-timetable, and they could put classes into the right size rooms. So, for example, if you had 200 people enrolled in your class, you might have been given a very big lecture theatre, but actually only 20 of them ever turn up to the seminars, so you really need a smaller one. So that's an example of this sort of analytic being put into practice. The picture there, which is, sorry, rather blurry because I grabbed it from YouTube, is a video which went up on the internet last week. It's from a school in China. In that school in China, they are using facial recognition software to monitor the expression constantly of every student in the room, and then the algorithm tells them if those students are bored, happy, engaged, tuned out. And it's quite an incredible video if you watch it, you know, and the teacher has got up on screen, you know, there are 5 bored students over there. Now, for one thing, in a room that size, if you can't tell if your students are bored, you're not a very good teacher, are you, frankly? But that is the sort of scary direction that things can go in if we don't keep an eye on them. So we need to think about what's good about these possibilities and also what's bad about these possibilities. Provocation 2. A decade from now, learners' personal data are tracked. Some of you may be wearing smartwatches, Apple Watches, Fitbits, you may use heart rate monitors, you may do Map My Run. Lots of personal data is now being put online. That's a picture there from about 10 years ago of my son wearing something which is monitoring his brain waves, and these brain waves are being used to control that floating ball. So all sorts of things which are going on inside your body, which, you know, 20 years ago, nobody would know anything about, you wouldn't know anything about, they are now in the form of data. Do we want to use that data for learning analytics? Is it useful for learning analytics? So we had an example at the Open University a few years ago. A group from the business school worked with financial traders in the stock market. They wired them up for heart rate, for galvanic skin response, and they could tell when those traders were stressed, and then they could look at the sort of decisions they made when they were stressed and when they weren't stressed, and they could work with traders who made bad decisions when stressed to reduce those stress levels. So that's an example of sort of training, workplace training, which makes use of this sort of data. But would we be comfortable with having that sort of data collected in our classrooms, in our lecture theatres? Do we see that as a good way to go or a bad way to go? Not all our provocations were about things which might happen with learning analytics. Some of them are about things which could go badly wrong with learning analytics. So we might turn around in 10 years' time and go, well, that was all a fad. Nobody talks about analytics anymore. Well, that's a possibility. The In Bloom project was a massive project funded in the United States by the Gates Foundation. I think it took $100,000, and the idea was to collect data from different schools, different school boards, bring it together, analyse it, and use it to support the school-time learners. They didn't bring the parents on board. And so the parents were really, really worried about, well, why is my child's personal data being collected and given to something with the name of Gates on it? It was the Gates Foundation. It wasn't actually being given to Bill Gates, but the perception was that children's personal data was being harvested, given to Bill Gates, who is an evil millionaire, and there was so much protest about it, the entire project was shut down. So $100,000 completely wasted. So it's not inevitable that learning analytics will go ahead. It only goes ahead if we make something positive of it. This is a really up-to-the-minute one in terms of GDPR. A decade from now, learners control their own data. So something we always have to think about with learning analytics is who owns that data? Who is in charge of that data? Who do we have to ask to gather that data? Who do we have to ask to analyse that data? And for those of you who are involved in learning analytics and have been worrying about GDPR in these terms, there's a new set of guidelines out from JISC that you can find on the web, which are really helpful if you're finding that problematic. Open systems being widely adopted. So if you're not technically minded, you may not be terribly interested in open systems. But open systems are ways of getting different systems to talk to each other. And they mean that if you've got different sets of analytics, they can be mixed together rather than you having to buy into one vendor or another. So I talked to somebody from a university in Ireland a couple of years ago. They said, we bought into one analytics system. We spent a huge amount of money at our university. It was just about to launch. The company went bust. And all that work went to waste because it didn't talk to any other system. So we brought in another company and we spent thousands and thousands of pounds, euros with them. And then that worked very well for 6 months, and then they diversified into other areas, and we were back at the beginning again because the systems didn't talk to each other. So open systems, really important, and if you're on the technical side, it's worth thinking about what sort of system are we using. A decade from now, learning analytics may be essential tools. Every learner may be raised up by hundreds of thousands of points of data. That would be a nice thing to aim for, but can we achieve it? And do we believe it's possible? This is the one I like the best, I think. A decade from now, analytics will help learners to make the right choices. So the analytics won't be in control. The learners will be in control, but the analytics will be helping them, be presenting choices, presenting options, and perhaps recommending things. And then provocation 8, a decade from now, analytics will completely have replaced teachers. Now that sounds a scary thing, but actually if you think about something like MOOCs, where you might have 10,000 learners, but you've only got the money to put in a teacher for a short period of time, you might actually want analytics that are supporting teachers. Or if you are a teacher, you might think, well, bits of my job are really boring. Wouldn't it be great if an analytic could take over that boring bit so I can do the more creative bits? So there are people down at the University of Sydney are using learning analytics to help them to provide detailed feedback to students. Students perceive it as better feedback than they were getting when the lecturer had to go manually through a huge set of data to find it, and then that frees the lecturer up to do something else. So what roles would we like analytics to take on, and what roles do we feel really must be done by a teacher, and we'd like to increase the teacher's role there? Those are my provocations from that project. I've just added another set of provocations which came from this year's big Learning Analytics Conference in Sydney. Neil Selwyn from Monash University was one of our keynotes there, and he came up with a set of provocations. You won't be able to read those. This is his learning analytics wish list. He typed it up and then he took a photo of it on his hotel room floor when he was preparing his keynote. Some of the ideas from it I've put over there. If you find my, well, you could find his keynote on the web. It's a brilliant keynote if you're interested. But pulling out some things, he's interested in making algorithms more transparent. So what's going on behind the scenes? Can we expose that to learners? Can we expose that to educators so they know whether they can trust what's in there? Sharing the profits of learning data. He pointed out that data is actually very valuable. And actually, if groups of students get together, they've got quite a marketable commodity there, which they might offer to people in return for something. And it might be in return for money, but it might be in return for help or support or guidance, helping students to understand that that is a marketable thing. Working towards a better public understanding of analytics. So not seeing these as black box things that somebody provides to you and it tells you what to do, but actually helping to involve people. So the provocations keep changing all the time. The possibilities for the future keep changing all the time. So in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to sort of whiz through, well, if you're inspired to do something with analytics in your institution, how might you go about it? What sort of steps are involved to implementing analytics in your institution? And again, this came out of a European project. The LEAP project was looking at learning analytics in the future, how educational policy could change to support them. And we carried out a study of literature, of tools that are used, of case studies. We brought experts together, students together, teachers together, unions together to talk about where learning analytics are going. And we came up with this Action for Analytics framework, these 7 steps towards implementation of analytics. And even if you're not a person who's going to be involved in high-level implementation, it's worth thinking about how you might be involved, how you might comment, how you might help to steer within your institution. So right at the beginning is thinking about aligning work on learning analytics with your institutional objectives, because if they're not aligned with what you're trying to achieve, eventually you're going to run into a brick wall because nobody's going to be interested in supporting them. You need a roadmap for where you're going, because this is a big project. This is something which does take years, does involve a lot of people. You need somebody who's responsible, and you need somebody really as high up in your institution as possible to be responsible, because they're going to have to bring together data sets, they're going to have to bring together teams of people, they're going to have to discuss expertise. So we had a Pro-Vice Chancellor who led an initiative which helped to achieve things that those of us lower down really couldn't have achieved without her. Go to events like this, talk to other people, find out what they're doing in their institutions. There's wonderful learning analytics work going on in Scotland. You're going to hear some of the OU Scotland work in workshops later. Edinburgh's been doing fabulous work. I know Strathclyde's been doing fabulous work. So there's people locally that you can talk to who can help you with this. But this isn't just a one-off. Don't just think this is what we're doing with learning analytics and this is what we're always going to do with learning analytics. Revisit what you're trying to achieve. Have you got to those goals? What are your new goals? There's research and development opportunities there. If you've got analytics, how can you build them into your teaching and learning to make good use of them? If you've got strategic priorities and there aren't any analytics, you need people to help you to develop them. You need the technology that brings your data together and gets your analytics in the hands of people who want them. You need frameworks that are going to drive you forward. And that's an example of a framework from the Sheila project, which the OU and Edinburgh have both been involved in, which is that reported in Brussels, I think, yesterday. So that's got a very good framework you might want to use. In terms of infrastructure, there's lots of things you need in terms of infrastructure. You do need to increase your data handling capacity. No matter how good your data handling capacity, you probably need to improve it. You probably need more systems talking to each other. I think we're going to hear later about the different forms of data you might collect. You know, is your library data able to talk to your registration data? Is your registration data able to talk to your exams data? Or are they all separate, controlled by other people, using different terminology? You want ways of sharing experience of good practice. So if you've got a community of practice around learning analytics, if you can set one up, we've got one at the Open University, people talking to each other all the time about what they're doing. In terms of context, don't just think about analytics in terms of universities, which has been the tendency over the first few years. There's more and more learning analytics work happening in schools now. more practitioners getting involved in that, more students getting involved in the process and talking to people about, well, those analytics aren't really very useful to me. These are the sort of analytics that I need. And so opening up possibilities for people who are really using these analytics to talk to the developers. So often it's a sort of top-down, the developers and the researchers come up with an idea, but actually in practice, people are interested in something else. I've said identify successful financial models. Learning analytics don't come cheap. You need this infrastructure, you need this expertise, you need to think about what is that going to buy you, how are you going to justify that expense? Could that money be better spent in a different way? Learning analytics isn't necessarily the solution. Where is it the solution? I'm just going to skip through the last ones quite quickly because I know I'm coming up to time. Standards, if you build in common standards from the beginning, it makes life so much easier because your systems all talk to each other. There are standards around like XAPI and Caliper, which use the same terminology. Think about ethical frameworks. There are ethical frameworks out there already. The Open University's got one we're very proud of, but there's also one's been developed in South Africa at the Open University of the Netherlands. JISC is one. So ethics, people are concerned about their data. It has got personal information in. It can have sensitive information in. You need to bear that in mind from the beginning. You need a robust quality assurance process. Just because this algorithm works with one group of students in 1 year, will it work with a different group of students with a slightly different curriculum in a slightly different context? You need to keep revisiting that. You need to have ways of evaluating what you're using. You need to find the skills. Have you got all the skills that you need to make this work? This is a sort of skills framework and a data framework which we worked with in the Open University for several years to begin to identify that. So some of the people who need to have skills, it's not just about developing algorithms, it's not just about collecting data, it's about training lecturers and teachers to make use of these, but also to be able to critique these, to know what to ask for. It's about helping educational leaders to implement the change. And it's also about helping learners to use the analytics, not just presenting them with analytics and saying, well, that's going to help you, but telling them how it's going to help and how they can use it and how they can influence change. Engage with stakeholders, really engage with stakeholders. This is becoming more and more apparent in learning analytics, that it's the end users who need to have a say right from the beginning. Work with the commercial organisations. They're really keen to know what you want so that they can sell you things that you want. So be prepared to work with them and tell them what you want. And tell people about learning analytics. You know, if learning analytics are really going to work, so for example, if they're going to work at Glasgow Caledonian, I should be able to walk out into the university and ask anybody, tell me what you're doing with learning analytics, and they should know. It shouldn't be a sort of mysterious thing that 1 or 2 people know about. And just overall, stay connected. There's lots of ways of getting involved in the learning analytics community. You can go to the Society for Learning Analytics Research website. You can get involved in the annual conferences. They have learning analytics summer institutes around the world. There's one happening in New York next week, but there's ones happen in Europe, which are much easier to get to. Look at the website, find out what's going on, and just network with people. There's loads of people in this room who are interested, who have expertise, who you can link up with, who can help you to develop things if that's the direction you want to go in. So I'll end there. The presentation is up on SlideShare if you want to get any of it again. And if you want to get in touch with me, that's how to do it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Colleagues, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Anyone would like to ask a question?
Nobody would like to ask a question.
Yes, up at the back. Can you just say who you are as well, please, before you...
Hi, my name name is Elizabeth Shively. I'm from the University of St. Andrews. Thank you so much for such a stimulating presentation. And I'm new to this, so forgive me if this is an ignorant question. But can you clarify for me what is the difference between a supporting resource, a tool that is a supporting resource, and a tool that is something that measures? Because some of the examples that you gave, and I'm thinking about the reflective writing example that you gave, seemed more like it was something that would measure, that it would be as something that would support rather than measure what students were doing. So I'm wondering what the difference is between a supporting tool and a measuring tool.
Okay, so one of the distinctions you can make is between learning analytics and academic analytics. And what I'd say academic analytics are, they make use of the same sort of data, they go through the same sort of processes, but they use really to support management, to support the institution. So if you're looking at things like institutional dropout, if you're looking at things like how does my institution compare with another institution, if you're looking at something like PISA figures, how does my country compare with other countries, I'd classify those sort of measuring things as really academic analytics. I would classify as learning analytics something which is being used to support learners and to support teachers. And you do see this distinction between learning analytics and academic analytics coming up in the literature. I think one of the things which makes people wary about analytics is the idea they are being measured, that they are being judged. That we saw that at the Open University when we began to talk to people. Some of our lecturers were very worried that we were using this tool as a means of judging them and assessing them. So we had to make it very clear how we were using the tool, how we were not using the tool, and again, this is a question of context, of talking to end users, of talking about perceptions, of talking about how things can be misused, and avoiding that. Is that clear?
We've got a question on Twitter down the front here, please.
There's been a lot of really good engagement on Twitter, comments and questions. The example you gave about the facial recognition in China caught a lot of traction. One person said that they were asking for a friend if said software is available for Tinder liaisons.
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
We've got a question from Caroline Langfeld. She asks, how do we best balance the use of learning analytics to improve teaching while still keeping the individual student's best interests in mind?
I think this is something that I just keep coming back to time and time again, the idea of user-centered design, of involving people from the beginning, of not just bringing users in at one step in the process. You might say, well, we consulted 3 years ago and the user said this. Well, they might have said that then, but now they've had more experience, things have changed, let's go back to them. And another thing that might happen is you go through all the process of doing the development, then you present something to students or to educators and they say, well, we knew that, why are you telling us that? You find that a lot actually with predictive analytics. People spend a huge amount of time going through data sets and they say, at the end of that, out of your cohort, I can tell you that X, Y, and Z aren't doing very well. Yeah, well, hang on. I knew in week 1 that X, Y, and Z weren't doing very well. I've been supporting them on that. Can you tell me something else? Can you tell me something I didn't know? Can you tell me something I want to know? So I think all the way down the line is user-centered design, user engagement.